For the past several decades, our planet and its population have begun to experience the negative impacts of using fossil fuels. Experts fear that we are already facing the consequences of global climate change, which will exceedingly worsen unless we intervene. And researchers are working hard on finding answers. Over the next few minutes, we will explore how geothermal resources and new advances in science and technology can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, enhance renewable energy production, and store that energy for when it's needed most. Researchers are discovering how novel approaches will dramatically increase the effectiveness of geothermal energy, fitting it fully within the constellation of energy technologies. So, let's start our journey. We live in a world that relies heavily on affordable and readily available energy. Our gadgets, our buildings, our infrastructure, our transportation would barely exist without it. Fortunately, the energy we need is abundant, but there's a problem here. The majority of energy sources we rely on today are threatening our way of life. Scientific consensus overwhelmingly concludes that the global climate is changing in large part as a consequence of human activities. The accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, most notably carbon dioxide, or CO2, emitted from the processes that power our economies and manufacture our materials, is thickening a blanket in the atmosphere. This blanket is trapping more heat close to the Earth's surface, increasing temperatures worldwide, intensifying droughts, heat waves, and storms, expanding migration of disease-carrying insects, changing sea levels, and making oceans more acidic, harming their fragile ecosystems. We are already experiencing these impacts, produced by the accumulation of past greenhouse gas emissions. And with the huge inertia in the Earth's system, the impacts of our emissions today will be felt for many decades to come. In order to protect our future, societies must reduce the amount of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere. This can be accomplished by capturing CO2 emissions from current processes and by developing new processes that provide electricity without emitting carbon dioxide. Developing and deploying these alternative methods for producing and using energy will not only combat climate change, they will also improve health, economic, social, and geopolitical conditions. The sustainable energy systems we need to deploy will require a portfolio of energy technologies. Some of these sources produce electricity from conventional fossil fuels like coal or natural gas, whose carbon dioxide emissions are captured. And some use renewable resources such as wind, sunlight, and geothermal heat with little to no inherent carbon dioxide emissions. A key commonality among these approaches is minimal CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, and consequently less negative impact on the climate, and thus our environment, health, and economies. Wind can provide a clean source of energy, but it is variable. The amount of electricity produced depends on how much the wind blows. Similarly, sunlight can be converted to electricity without emitting carbon dioxide, but solar energy also suffers from variability. Geothermal energy is clean and continuous because the Earth's interior is always hot. It provides electricity even when there is no wind and no sun. We take advantage of the fact that the Earth's temperature increases with depth. Deep underground, far below aquifers used for drinking water, the rock transfers heat energy into water that is isolated and extremely salty. Let's take a closer look at what happens at the surface and in the geothermal reservoir. Wells are drilled to extract the hot water, pump it through a power plant that converts the heat to electricity, and then inject the cooler water back underground to be reheated. Since nothing is burned, this closed-loop process does not produce carbon dioxide. but conventional geothermal energy approaches have shortcomings. Current technology requires high-temperature water to produce electricity. No hot water, no energy. As a result, traditional geothermal power plants must be located where the subsurface temperature is high near the surface, like in parts of California and Nevada. Geothermal, wind, and solar technologies are great tools in addressing the energy and climate change problems, but they aren't enough on their own. Roughly 80% of the electricity produced in the United States comes from over 500 power plants that use fossil fuels like coal and natural gas. These plants are likely to be around for a long time. The U.S. has large reserves of fossil fuels, and it will not run out for hundreds of years. In addition, these power plants are significant capital investments. So once they're built, the owners want to operate them for a long time. And they produce electricity that is relatively cheap if the negative impacts of using fossil fuel are not considered. These economic factors make it easier to ignore the impacts on our climate caused by the carbon dioxide emissions from fossil-fueled power plants and from other stationary sources, like oil refineries and cement manufacturers. But scientists are developing techniques to keep fossil fuel plants running while combating climate change and improving the economics of clean energy sources all at once. One promising strategy starts with a technique called carbon dioxide capture and storage, or CCS. With CCS, a device is installed at a power plant or other stationary carbon dioxide source to remove, or capture, the CO2 before it's emitted into the atmosphere. The captured carbon dioxide is compressed into a liquid and then transported, most likely by pipeline, to a location where it can be pumped underground into large geologic reservoirs. As before, let's take a look at what happens at the surface, while we also travel deep into the earth. These reservoirs are made of permeable rock deep below the surface, where fluids like oil, natural gas, and salty water have been contained for millions of years. Just above is a layer of highly impermeable caprock, which keeps the fluids from rising toward the surface. In well-sited locations, multiple caprock layers may exist further up, serving as additional seals. In order to store the carbon dioxide in this reservoir, a well is drilled deep underground. When the liquid carbon dioxide reaches the reservoir, its relatively light density forms a plume above the other fluids. It pools below the caprock and stays contained, unable to enter the Earth's atmosphere. This approach is based on standard techniques in the oil and gas industry. By putting carbon dioxide underground rather than into the atmosphere, CCS is another tool in our efforts to combat climate change. Recently, scientists, engineers, and economists have begun to investigate synergies between CCS and geothermal energy. What if we use captured CO2 to enhance geothermal energy production? Replacing water with carbon dioxide yields a number of benefits. First, CO2 flows more easily than water. As a result, it can extract the same amount of energy from the ground with less effort. Second, note the fluid at the injection well is under low pressure because it is cool, and the fluid at the production well is under higher pressure because it is hot. The amount of energy that can be produced is dependent on the difference in pressure between the wells. Hot water is under more pressure than cold water, and it yields a good amount of energy. But when CO2 is heated, the pressure changes much more, and the energy yield is substantially greater as a result. Third, the heated carbon dioxide expands so much that it will buoyantly rise through the production well. Scientists refer to this unique effect as a thermosiphon. This can reduce or eliminate the need to use the well pumps, and more energy can be available for the consumer. A new type of power plant, a CO2 Plume geothermal plant, or CPG, can use the improved flow rate, the pressure difference, and the thermosiphon to generate electricity at shallower, cooler depths than is possible with water. This expands the locations where geothermal energy production is cost-effective and competitive with other sources of electricity. Plants at existing locations can also run more effectively. CO2 Plume geothermal power plants can be built near stationary CO2 sources to reduce the distance that carbon dioxide would be transported. They can even vary their output and satisfy fluctuating demand for electricity. Selling this electricity can offset some of the cost of capturing the carbon dioxide from the coal-fired power plant. The ability to use carbon dioxide in this and other manners has led some to reframe CCS as CCUS, carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and storage. As societies begin to make emitting carbon dioxide more costly, use of geothermal energy in general, and CO2 Plume geothermal energy in particular, can help to alleviate the carbon dioxide problem and partially offset the increase in electricity prices. We can even use CO2 Plume geothermal energy and CCUS to make wind and solar energy more effective. Currently, when the wind blows during low electricity demand, like when people are asleep, the spinning turbines produce electricity that goes to waste if the energy is not stored. But if the wind farm is located near a CCUS facility, that otherwise wasted electricity can be used to compress and pump carbon dioxide into the reservoir, storing the energy for use later, when demand is higher. The electricity produced from the geothermal power plant is controllable. It can be used on its own or to satisfy electricity demand when not enough is being provided by wind or sunlight. There may even be benefits we don't know about yet. CO2 Plume geothermal is bringing together experts in geology, engineering, economics, public policy, and other areas, creating interdisciplinary teams of bright minds seeking to develop solutions to three of the most pressing and challenging problems of our time: global climate change, energy availability, and water conservation. And their scientific developments can spill over and lead to other unforeseen approaches. Who knows what great things this will lead to? Visit our website to learn more about climate change, conventional and renewable electricity, and how geothermal resources can be used to produce and store energy. Together, we can increase the sustainability of our environment, economy, and society.